All right. Um, you did it. We made it through the first week. First week and the last week are always the biggest ones in these online classes, just because you've got to go through all of the syllabus, all of the authentication stuff in the first week, and then the last week there's always the big paper that you have to do. But hey, you made it through the week. I tried to make it as easy as possible by only giving you one reading this week instead of two or three, and I tried to keep it relatively short as well. Um, so let's debrief a little bit. As I'm sure a lot of you noticed whenever you were doing your journal entry for the week, Gilgamesh, ancient Babylon, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Sumeria, take your pick. All three of them were heavily influenced by Gilgamesh. Um, Using the framework of our classical virtues, then they were a very courage based culture. Um, in previous semesters, whenever I've done this, then the general consensus has been that, oh, yeah, Gilgamesh is very brave, but he's dumber than a sack of hammers, as somebody put it, and quite frankly, had a hard time arguing with that when he's not a particularly contemplative character for most of the story. He's not a super compassionate character for most of the story, but he does teach us a lot about how to be courageous, and maybe teaches us some good lessons about what happens whenever we're not compassionate or contemplative enough in our own lives as well. Um, so hopefully you're starting to get a handle on that framework of the classical virtues. Um, we're going to continue working with that for the entire semester, very particularly next week, whenever we're looking at some of our Greek work, then since that's where that came from, it's going to come up again. Hopefully, you guys also got a little bit of a sense of, how our world is different than theirs. Um, Modern genetics say that half of you comes from your mother, half of you comes from your father. In Gilgamesh, then they thought that more of you came from your mother. Um, whether that was because she was divine, so contributed more, or because she was the mother, it's not entirely clear. We don't have a huge number of works from that time period that help us shed light on that. You may have noticed that Gilgamesh was a polytheistic culture. Obviously, we've got so many gods floating around in there, which is different than our world, even in the modern day. Um, Particularly in the United States, then we tend to be a monotheistic culture. There is one God. Even if somebody is atheist, then they tend to be rejecting the one God of Abraham, um, rather than the multiple gods. And that does lead to some very interesting stuff. And we're going to see some of that interesting stuff come up again next week as well. Because guess what? The Greeks were also polytheistic. Um, you may have noticed that they were also a very monarchical culture. Um, a lot of people have some very severe issues with prima nocta, the idea that Gilgamesh had the right to sleep with a bride on her wedding night, uh, whether or not she consented to that. Um, that was actually a very common part of monarchical cultures through, I believe, the 1400s is whenever it started dying out. There was still being practiced places until 1600s, I think. And there are actually a lot of places where it's actually still on the books today, just that they don't do that anymore. Very patriarchal, very anti feminist. But again, if you're going to say that courage and strength are the things that matter most, and the king is determined by his courage and strength, then from a genetic perspective, it does make a certain amount of sense. It's just certainly feels icky to me. I don't know about to you guys, not even in the sense of like, I want to be the first one with my wife kind of way, but just, ah, I don't want anybody to sleep with anybody else without their consent. If you want to make a T-shirt for this class, then maybe that should actually be on it because that's going to come up a couple more times. Um, it was a very different world from ours, but a lot of those underlying themes are still there. Great friendship between equals, challenging each other to be better, seeing what happens whenever we're challenging each other to be worse as well. Um, Fear of death, striving for immortality, and never technically reaching it. it's as true for us today as it was for them. That's part of the human condition. So that's one of the reasons that I always like to start off with Gilgamesh, just because, it's about as far temporally removed from us as we can be. And yet, a lot of the themes are still the same. The motifs have changed, the cultural values have changed, but a lot of the themes are still right there. So, I will see you guys next week. I'm going to give you a few days to finish off your reading, and then we're going to start in with the assignments for next week as well. See ya.